What happens when two of Hollywood's most beloved personalities find themselves on opposite sides of a conversation that spirals completely out of control? The tension in the studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And what started as a lighthearted chat about cooking and new beginnings turned into something nobody saw coming. Before we dive into every explosive moment of this interview, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment below telling me what you think really caused this clash. Because trust me, you're going to have opinions. The Drew Barrymore show has always been known for its warm, inviting atmosphere. Drew has this incredible gift of making her guests feel like they're just hanging out with an old friend, sharing stories over coffee. The set is bathed in soft, natural lighting. And there's always this sense that anything can be discussed in a safe, judgment-free space. That's exactly what made what happened with Valerie Bertinelli so shocking. Nobody expected the conversation to take the turn it did. And certainly nobody expected Valerie to react the way she ultimately would. Valerie walked onto the set looking radiant. Wearing a flowing cream-colored blouse and fitted black pants, her smile was wide, genuine, the kind that reaches your eyes and makes you believe everything in life is going exactly as it should. Drew greeted her with open arms, literally pulling her into one of those enthusiastic hugs she's famous for. The audience erupted in applause. These are two women who have been through so much in the public eye, both navigating divorces, both rebuilding their lives, both using their platforms to talk about self-love and healing. On paper, this should have been one of those beautiful conversations that leaves everyone feeling inspired and hopeful. Drew started things off the way she usually does, asking about Valerie's latest cookbook. Valerie lit up, talking about the recipes, about how cooking has always been her therapy, her way of connecting with people and with herself. She talked about a particular pasta dish that reminded her of her grandmother, and you could see the genuine emotion in her eyes as she described the memory. Drew listened intently, nodding along, asking follow-up questions that showed she'd actually done her research. The conversation flowed easily. They laughed about kitchen disasters, about the time Valerie accidentally used salt instead of sugar in a dessert, about Drew's attempts at making homemade bread during lockdown that turned out dense enough to use as a doorstop. But then Drew shifted gears. She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious, more intimate. She said she wanted to talk about something deeper, something she knew both of them had experienced: relationships, specifically the end of relationships and what comes after. Valerie's smile didn't falter, but something changed in her eyes. A flicker of caution, perhaps, or maybe just the natural defensiveness that comes when someone opens a door you're not sure you want to walk through on national television. Drew started talking about her own divorces, about how she's had to learn and relearn what it means to love herself, to not define her worth by whether someone chooses to stay or go. She was vulnerable, raw even, and the audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Then she turned the conversation directly to Valerie, asking her about the lessons she's learned from her own divorce, about how she's rebuilt her sense of self-worth. On the surface, it seemed like a reasonable question, the kind of thing you'd expect on a show that prides itself on deep, meaningful conversations. Valerie took a breath before answering. She talked about the pain of realizing a marriage wasn't working, about the shame she initially felt, about the fear of starting over. Her voice was steady, but you could hear the emotion underneath every word. She talked about learning to be alone without being lonely, about discovering parts of herself she'd forgotten existed. Drew nodded sympathetically, interjecting with little affirmations. Yes, exactly. I know that feeling. For a moment, it seemed like they were completely in sync, two women who understood each other's journeys on a profound level. But then Drew asked another question, and this is where things started to shift. She asked Valerie if she thought she'd stayed in her marriage too long, if there were signs she ignored because she was afraid of what leaving would mean. The question hung in the air for a moment. Valerie's expression changed, just slightly, a tightening around her eyes, a subtle stiffening of her shoulders. She answered carefully, saying that hindsight is always 20/20, that it's easy to look back and see things clearly that were murky in the moment. She said she did the best she could with what she knew at the time. Drew pressed on, though. She said something about how important it is to trust our instincts, to not ignore red flags just because we're comfortable or scared of change. And then she said something that seemed to touch a nerve. She suggested that sometimes we stay in situations that aren't serving us because we're more afraid of judgment, from others than we are committed to our own happiness. She said it with kindness in her voice, like she was offering wisdom, like she was trying to help. But Valerie's face showed that it didn't land that way. Valerie sat back in her chair, creating just a little more physical distance between herself and Drew. She said, with a slight edge to her voice, that every person's journey is different. That what looks like fear or weakness from the outside might actually be courage and commitment from the inside. She said that she resented the implication that she somehow failed herself by trying to make her marriage work. Drew's eyes widened slightly, and she immediately tried to backtrack, saying that wasn't what she meant at all, that she was speaking generally, not specifically about Valerie's situation, but the damage was done. The energy in the room had shifted. The warmth that had characterized the first part of the interview had evaporated, replaced by something tense and uncomfortable. The audience sat in awkward silence. You could see some people shifting in their seats, unsure whether to applaud or stay quiet. Drew tried to lighten the mood, making a joke about how conversations about relationships always get complicated. But Valerie didn't laugh. She gave a tight smile and said nothing. Drew, perhaps sensing she needed to change tactics, started talking about self-care and wellness routines. She asked Valerie about her workout regimen, about whether she's into meditation or journaling. Valerie answered, but her responses were shorter now, less effusive. She talked about walking her dog, about trying to stay active, but the enthusiasm from earlier was gone. She seemed guarded, careful, like she was waiting for the next uncomfortable question, and it came. Drew brought up social media, talking about how both of them have been open about their struggles online, about how sharing their vulnerabilities has connected them with millions of people. She said something about the power of authenticity, about how important it is to show the messy, imperfect parts of life, not just the highlight reel. Then she asked Valerie if she ever worried about sharing too much, about whether being so open online might make it harder to move forward privately. Valerie's jaw clenched. Just for a second, but it was noticeable. She said she shares what feels right to share, that she's not performing her healing for anyone's entertainment. She said that every post, every story, every recipe she shares comes from a genuine place, and she doesn't appreciate the suggestion that she's somehow exploiting her own pain for likes and followers. Her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. This wasn't just defensiveness anymore. This was anger. Drew looked genuinely taken aback. She stumbled over her words, trying to clarify that she wasn't suggesting Valerie was being inauthentic, that she was just curious about the balance between public and private. But Valerie cut her off, saying that maybe Drew needed to think about why she assumed there was some calculated strategy behind someone else's vulnerability. She said that just because Drew approaches her own public image a certain way doesn't mean everyone else does, doesn't mean everyone else has to. Even the crew members standing off to the side seemed frozen, unsure whether to keep cameras rolling or cut away. Drew's face flushed, and she looked down at her note cards, clearly flustered. She tried to move on, asking about Valerie's upcoming projects, but Valerie wasn't having it. She said she thought maybe they should talk about what was really happening here, about why this interview had turned into something that felt more like an interrogation than a conversation. Drew protested, saying she was just trying to have an honest discussion, that she thought they were both comfortable enough with each other to go deep. Valerie shot back that going deep doesn't mean making assumptions about someone else's choices or motivations. She said that Drew had been subtly criticizing her throughout the entire conversation, couching judgment in the language of concern and curiosity. And now that it was out in the open, the tension was impossible to ignore. Drew tried to recover, her voice taking on that soothing tone she uses when she wants to de-escalate a situation. She said she thought they were having a dialogue, a real conversation between two women who have both been through similar experiences. She said she never meant to make Valerie feel judged, that if she did, she was truly sorry. But there was something in the way she said it, something in her body language, that suggested she still didn't fully understand why Valerie was so upset. It was an apology that felt more like a formality than genuine remorse. Valerie wasn't buying it. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on Drew's, and said that the problem with conversations like this is that they're never really equal. She said that Drew gets to sit in the host chair, gets to ask the questions, gets to frame the narrative, while the guest is expected to just open up and be vulnerable on command. She said it's easy to talk about authenticity and healing when you're the one controlling the conversation, when you're not the one being dissected. Her voice was measured, controlled, but every word carried weight. The audience was completely still now. You could hear someone cough in the back row, the sound echoing through the studio, because everything else was so quiet. Drew's eyes were glistening, like she might cry, and she said she never thought about it that way. She said she's always tried to create a space where her guests feel empowered to share what they want to share, that she never wants anyone to feel exploited or manipulated. But even as she said it, you could see Valerie shaking her head slightly, like she'd heard this kind of defense before and didn't find it convincing. Valerie said that intentions don't erase impact. She said Drew might think she's creating a safe space, but what she's actually doing is using her platform to get people to reveal things they might not be ready to share, all in the name of connection and vulnerability. She said that, when you're in the guest chair, there's enormous pressure to give the host and the audience what they want, to be the kind of guest who opens up and makes people feel something. And when you resist that pressure, when you set boundaries, suddenly you're the difficult one, the one who's not being authentic enough. Drew looked stricken. She said she never wanted anyone to feel pressured, that if Valerie didn't want to talk about something, all she had to do was say so. Valerie let out a short, bitter laugh. She said it's not that simple, that saying no to a question on a show like this comes with its own set of consequences. She said viewers at home would wonder why you're being evasive, why you're not being open, and the host would pivot to another uncomfortable topic, trying to find the angle that gets you to crack open. She said the whole format is designed to extract vulnerability, whether the guest is truly comfortable or not. Drew's producer, standing just off camera, looked like she wanted to intervene, but Drew waved her off. She took a deep breath and said that maybe Valerie was right, that maybe she hadn't been as thoughtful as she should have been. But then she said something that made things even worse. She said that she thought Valerie would understand because they're both in the business of sharing themselves publicly, both building brands around authenticity and relatability. She said she thought they were on the same team. Valerie's expression hardened. She said that just because two people are public figures doesn't mean they're the same, doesn't mean they approach their careers and their personal lives the same way. She said she spent years trying to rebuild her privacy, trying to figure out what parts of her life belonged to her and her alone, while Drew seems to thrive on turning every personal moment into content. She said there's nothing wrong with either approach, but Drew needed to stop assuming everyone else operates the way she does. That seemed to hit Drew where it hurt. Her face flushed deeper, and she said that was unfair, that she's not just turning her life into content, she's trying to help people feel less alone. She said every time she shares something difficult, she gets messages from people saying it made them feel seen, made them feel like they weren't crazy or broken. She said that's why she does this, why she asks hard questions, because she believes in the power of shared experience. Her voice cracked slightly, and you could tell she was fighting back tears. Valerie's expression softened, but only slightly. She said she wasn't questioning Drew's intentions or the value of what she does for her audience. She said she was questioning why Drew assumed that because something works for her, it should work for everyone else. She said that what feels empowering to one person can feel invasive to another, and it's not the guest's job to manage the host's feelings about that. She said Drew needed to sit with the discomfort of knowing that sometimes her approach hurts people, even when she doesn't mean for it to. Drew was silent for a long moment. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of this incredibly uncomfortable exchange. Finally, she said she needed to process what Valerie was saying, that maybe they should take a break and come back to the conversation. But Valerie said no, they needed to finish this now. She said she didn't want to come back from a commercial break and pretend everything was fine, didn't want to paste on a smile and plug her cookbook like nothing had happened. She said if they were going to have a real conversation, it needed to be real all the way through. Drew looked at her producer again, who shrugged helplessly. This was completely off script, completely unlike anything that had ever happened on the show before. Drew turned back to Valerie and asked what she wanted to do, how she wanted to proceed. Valerie said she wanted Drew to acknowledge that the way she conducts interviews isn't neutral, that it's a choice with consequences. She said she wanted Drew to stop hiding behind the idea that she's just trying to help people and admit that there's an element of entertainment, of spectacle in what she does. Drew bristled at that. She said, of course, there's an entertainment element. It's a television show, but that doesn't negate the genuine connection and healing that happens. She said she's not going to apologize for trying to make difficult conversations accessible and engaging. She said that if she just sat down and had dry clinical conversations about mental health and relationships, nobody would watch, and then nobody would be helped. She said there's value in making these topics entertaining, in wrapping important messages in a format people actually want to consume. Valerie said that might be true. But Drew needed to be honest about the trade-offs. She said, when you prioritize entertainment, you inevitably end up pushing people further than they want to go, digging deeper than they're comfortable with, all because it makes for better television. She said the audience's desire to be entertained and the guest's need for boundaries are often at odds, and in that conflict, the host usually sides with the audience. She said that's what Drew had been doing throughout this entire interview, prioritizing what would make compelling content over Valerie's obvious discomfort. Drew denied that, saying she stopped the moment Valerie expressed discomfort, that she tried to apologize and move on. Valerie shot back that Drew only stopped after Valerie explicitly called her out, after she made it impossible to ignore. She said all the subtle cues she'd been giving, the shorter answers, the shift in body language, the edge in her voice, Drew had ignored all of it because she was focused on getting the interview she wanted. She said a truly empathetic host would have picked up on those cues and adjusted course. Without needing to be told, the accusation hung in the air. Drew's hands were shaking slightly, and she clasped them together in her lap. She said she wasn't perfect, that she was learning and growing just like everyone else. She said she was sorry if she missed Valerie's cues, that she would try to be more aware in the future. But Valerie said sorry wasn't enough, not when this pattern keeps repeating. She said she'd watched other interviews Drew had done, seen other guests look uncomfortable while Drew pushed forward. Always in the name of authenticity and connection. Drew looked genuinely hurt now. She said she's built her entire career on being open and honest, on creating spaces where people feel safe to be themselves. She said if Valerie thought she was exploitative or manipulative, then maybe Valerie shouldn't have agreed to come on the show in the first place. Her voice had an edge to it now, a defensiveness that matched Valerie's anger. The dynamic had completely shifted. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was personal. Valerie said she came on the show because she thought Drew would understand, would treat her with respect and care. She said she thought they had enough in common that the conversation would be collaborative, not adversarial. She said she was wrong, and she was done pretending otherwise. She started to stand up, and Drew reached out as if to stop her, saying they should finish the conversation. That walking away wouldn't solve anything. Valerie paused, halfway out of her seat. She looked at Drew with an expression that was equal parts anger and sadness. She said that staying and continuing to engage with someone who wasn't really hearing her wouldn't solve anything either. She said sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to participate in a dynamic that's hurting you. She said she was setting a boundary right now, in real time, and Drew needed to respect it. Drew's face went through a series of emotions in rapid succession: shock, hurt, frustration, and finally something that looked almost like desperation. She said she understood boundaries, that she respected them completely, but she felt like they were so close to a breakthrough here, so close to really understanding each other. She said walking away now would leave everything unresolved, would leave the audience confused and unsatisfied. Valerie turned to face her fully and said maybe the audience needed to sit with that confusion, needed to see what it looks like when someone prioritizes their own well-being over giving people what they want. That statement seemed to resonate through the entire studio. The audience members looked at each other, some nodding slowly, others looking uncomfortable. Drew sat back in her chair, and for the first time in the entire interview, she seemed truly at a loss for words. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. She said she didn't know what to say, that she felt like anything she said at this point would just make things worse. Valerie said that was probably true, that sometimes the best thing you can do is just let someone go without trying to fix it or control the narrative. But Drew couldn't help herself. She asked if they could at least end on a positive note, if they could find some common ground before Valerie left. She said the audience had come to see both of them, had been looking forward to this conversation, and she didn't want to disappoint them. Valerie let out a long exhale and said that was exactly the problem, that Drew was more concerned about disappointing the audience than respecting Valerie's clear statement that she needed to leave. She said this was a perfect example of what she'd been talking about. that the show always came first, the guests' feelings always came second. Drew shook her head vigorously. She said that wasn't fair, that she cared about Valerie, that she was genuinely trying to understand where this had all gone wrong. She said she'd thought they were friends, or at least friendly, and she was devastated that Valerie felt this way. Valerie said that maybe they weren't as close as Drew thought, that maybe Drew had constructed an idea of their relationship based on their public personas rather than any real connection. She said Drew seemed to do that a lot, assume intimacy with people because of shared experiences or similar life circumstances, without actually doing the work of building genuine trust. That observation seemed to shake Drew to her core. Her eyes filled with tears that she didn't bother to hide. She said she was just trying to connect, trying to be real with people, and now she was being told that even that was somehow wrong or manipulative. She said she didn't know how to be anymore, didn't know what was authentic and what was performance. Her voice broke, and she pressed her hand to her chest as if trying to physically hold herself together. The vulnerability was raw and real, and for a moment, it seemed like maybe Valerie would soften, would sit back down and comfort her. But Valerie didn't move. She stood there, watching Drew cry, and her expression was complicated. There was empathy there, but also resolve. She said softly that she wasn't responsible for Drew's emotional spiral, that Drew needed to process these feelings with a therapist or trusted friends, not use them to guilt Valerie into staying. She said this was another pattern she'd noticed, that when Drew got uncomfortable or felt criticized, she would become so vulnerable and wounded that the other person felt obligated to take care of her, to reassure her, to make it okay. She said she wasn't going to do that. The audience gasped. Some people looked shocked. Others looked like they wanted to applaud but weren't sure if they should. Drew wiped her eyes and said she wasn't trying to manipulate anyone, that these were just her genuine feelings. Valerie said she believed that. Drew believed that. But impact matters more than intention. She said Drew's genuine feelings were valid, but they didn't obligate Valerie to stay and manage them. She said women are socialized to take care of everyone else's emotions, and she was done with that, especially in professional settings like this. Drew looked around the studio as if searching for someone to back her up, to tell her she wasn't crazy or wrong. Her producer looked away. The audience was silent. Even the crew members seemed frozen, unsure whether to keep filming or shut everything down. Drew turned back to Valerie and said she guessed there was nothing left to say then, that if Valerie wanted to go, she should go. But there was something passive-aggressive in the way she said it. A slight edge that suggested she was hurt and angry and trying not to show it. Valerie caught it. She said she would go, but first she wanted to say something directly to the camera, to the people watching at home. Drew looked panicked and said, maybe they should discuss what Valerie wanted to say first, make sure it was appropriate. Valerie raised an eyebrow and asked who got to decide what was appropriate, who got to control her message. Drew stammered that she just meant they should be thoughtful, that this was a sensitive situation. Valerie said it was her truth, and she had every right to share it however she wanted. Drew reluctantly gestured to the camera, indicating Valerie could go ahead. Valerie turned to face the lens directly, and her posture straightened. Her voice became clear and strong. She said she wanted everyone watching to know that it's okay to set boundaries, even in situations where you feel pressured to keep going. She said it's okay to walk away from conversations that feel harmful, even if other people think you're being difficult or oversensitive. She said your discomfort is valid, your instincts are valid, and you don't owe anyone access to your pain just because they're curious or because it might help someone else. The words landed with weight. You could see people in the audience nodding, some with tears in their eyes. Drew sat motionless, watching Valerie address the camera, and her expression was unreadable. Valerie continued, saying that she'd learned the hard way that protecting your peace sometimes means disappointing people, means being seen as the bad guy. She said she was okay with that she'd rather be whole and misunderstood than broken and praised for her authenticity. She said she hoped anyone watching who'd ever felt pressured to share more than they wanted to would take this as permission to stop, to say no, to leave. When she finished, she turned back to Drew. Drew's face was wet with tears, and she looked small in her chair, diminished somehow. She said quietly that she heard Valerie, that she would think about everything she'd said. Valerie nodded once, a sharp, definitive gesture. She said she hoped Drew really would think about it, would examine how she uses vulnerability as currency and what that costs the people around her. She said it wasn't too late for Drew to change, to build a show that truly prioritized guest comfort over audience entertainment. But it would require admitting that the current model is flawed. Drew said nothing. She just sat there, staring at her hands. Valerie took that as her cue to leave. She turned toward the exit, her heels clicking against the studio floor, each step echoing in the silence. The audience watched her go, and nobody applauded, nobody booed. They just watched. It felt like witnessing something historic, something that would be talked about for years. Drew finally looked up, watching Valerie's back as she walked away, and you could see her mouth moving like she wanted to call out, wanted to say something that would make Valerie turn around. But she didn't. She let Valerie go. And as Valerie reached the edge of the set, as she was about to step through the curtain and disappear, Drew finally spoke. She said, just loud enough for the microphones to catch, that she was sorry. Valerie paused for just a fraction of a second, not quite long enough to be a full stop, but long enough to show she'd heard. Then she kept walking, and she was gone. The studio remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Drew sat in her chair, the cameras still rolling, capturing every moment of her processing what had just happened. She looked at the audience and attempted a weak smile, saying she guessed that didn't go as planned. A few people laughed nervously, but most remained quiet. Drew said she needed a minute, that they were going to cut and regroup. She looked at her producer and nodded. And finally, mercifully, someone called "cut." But even after the cameras stopped rolling, the impact of what had happened lingered. The crew members spoke in hushed tones, the audience filed out quietly, and Drew remained in her chair, staring at the empty seat where Valerie had been. Whatever she'd expected from this interview, it wasn't this. And whatever relationship she'd thought she had with Valerie was now irreparably changed. The conversation had started as so many do, with good intentions and the promise of connection. But it ended with a stark reminder that vulnerability can't be demanded, that authenticity can't be performed on command, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is walk away. What do you think? Was Valerie right to leave, or should she have stayed and worked it out with Drew? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed because we've got more stories coming that you won't want to miss.